Good morning. My name is Mark Baldessari, and I am the President and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California and Director of the PPIC Statewide Survey. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring the May PPIC survey on Californians and their government. This survey was conducted with funding from the R.J. and Frances Miller Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, and the PPIC Donor Circle. We thank them for their generous support. We also thank the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle for the support of this virtual event. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. For today's program, Dr. Dean Bonner will walk you through some of the key survey findings. After the presentation, we will discuss some of our takeaways, and then we will answer audience questions. If you have a question about the survey, please send an email and include your name and organization to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We have time later on for these questions. That's ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And now I'd like to welcome my colleague, Dr. Dean Bonner, who is the Associate Survey Director and a Research Fellow at PPIC. Thank you, Dean, for joining us today.
Hi, thanks, Mark. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started here. All right, so PPIC has been conducting 4 or 5 Californians in their government surveys since 1999. And for those not familiar with the statewide survey, the survey's mission is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions that we hope will inform and improve state policymaking, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. Since 1998, we have completed about 200 surveys and given a voice to nearly 400,000 Californians. This particular survey examines public perceptions, attitudes, and policy preferences about a variety of state and national issues. The survey was conducted from May 9th to the 18th, which was right during the time when the governor was introducing his budget. The interviews were conducted mostly on cell phone, 3/4 on cell phone, 1/4 on landline. And we talked to about 1,700 likely voters and just over 1,700 adults and just over 1,000 likely voters. Okay. And so in the midst of introducing a budget that seems like it's one for the ages, just over half of Californians approve of Governor Newsom. Approval among all adults and likely voters today is very similar to January and to last February before the initial stay-at-home order, but has fallen 10 points since last May. The governor's approval rating is driven by a partisan divide, with 3 in 4 Democrats approving and 3 in 4 Republicans disapproving. We find that adults across the state vary in their perceptions of the governor, with about 6 in 10 in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles approving, compared to about half in Orange, San Diego counties and the Central Valley, while notably fewer than 4 in 10 approve of the governor in the Inland Empire. When it comes to the California legislature, about half of adults and 4 in 10 likely voters approve, with findings very similar to January, but once again down from last May. Similar patterns to gubernatorial approval can be seen in legislative approval this month. And so while the exact date is not yet known for a recall, and there's lots of discussion about that lately, all signs point to a likely recall election late summer or early fall. And if the election were held today, 4 in 10 likely voters would vote to remove the governor, while 57% would vote to keep him. Findings are nearly identical to March, and notably, the 4 in 10 who support the recall today is similar to the 38% who voted for John Cox in November of 2018. Once again, we see a wide partisan divide here, with 8 in 10 Republican likely voters wanting to remove the governor, 8 in 10 Democratic likely voters want to keep the governor, and independents are evenly divided on the recall. In addition to a partisan divide, there is a gender divide, where we find that men are essentially divided on the recall, while 2 in 3 women would prefer to keep Governor Newsom and not recall him. Majorities across racial ethnic groups want to keep Governor Newsom. However, this view is held by 3 in 4 African Americans, 2 in 3 Asian Americans and Latinos, compared to about half of whites. And looking at what would be the effect of the recall election in terms of the change it would bring, we find that a plurality of Californians think that if Governor Newsom is recalled, that things in the state would get worse. 3 in 10 think that things would get better, and 3 in 10 say it would make no difference. To put this in context, in the lead up to the recall election in 2003, we found that a plurality of 4 in 10 or more were saying that things would get better if Gray Davis was removed from office. Looking today, we find that a majority of Republicans think things would get better, a majority of Democrats thinks things would get worse, and independents are pretty evenly divided on this. Across regions, the share saying things would get worse ranges from 23% in the Inland Empire to 40% in the San Francisco Bay Area. And once again, there's a gender divide here as well, with 3 in 10 men compared to 4 in 10 women saying that things would get worse if the governor was recalled. And as I mentioned earlier, the survey was fielded as the governor came out with daily sneak peeks at his budget plan. And this historic budget and what the governor has deemed the California Comeback Plan has Californians feeling positively about the budget situation. In fact, a record low 36% actually currently view the state budget situation as a big problem. And to put that in perspective, the record high for saying the budget is a big problem was 81% in May of 2010 during the Great Recession, when then Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger was trying to address a $19.9 billion budget gap. Today, we find that nearly 2 in 3 Republicans view the budget situation as a big problem, compared to about 4 in 10 independents and 1 in 4 Democrats. Half of adults in the Inland Empire call the budget situation a big problem, compared to about 4 in 10 in Central Valley and about 1 in 3 elsewhere in the state. And as California emerges out of the pandemic, there's a wide divide between Californians across income groups regarding how they view their own personal financial situation. About half of Californians currently say they're in excellent or good financial shape, while about half say they're in only fair or poor. But the differences across income groups are stark, with lower income residents much less likely than upper income residents to view their economic situation positively. And there are differences across racial ethnic groups, with 1 in 3 Latinos and 4 in 10 African Americans having a positive view of their economic situation compared to majorities of Asian Americans and whites. And these differences also extend to home ownership, with renters far less likely than homeowners to say that they're in excellent or good financial shape. Staying on the economic theme, Californians continue to recognize that the gap between the rich and the poor is getting larger, and most also agree that the state should do more to reduce this gap. There is bipartisan agreement that the gap is getting wider. However, Republican support for state action to reduce this gap falls well short of a majority. More than 6 in 10 across most demographic groups think that the gap is getting larger, with the exceptions where we find that about half of Latinos, half of those with incomes under 40,000, and half with only a high school degree hold this view. And when it comes to state action to reduce this gap, we find that while majorities across regions and demographic groups think the action should be taken, men are less likely than women, whites are less likely than other racial ethnic groups to hold this view, and support for state action declines with rising income. We find today that approval of President Biden remains high and is similar to the 70% who approved of his job performance in January. About 9 in 10 Democrats, 6 in 10 independents approve, compared to 2 in 10 Republicans. Noteworthy that the 2 in 10 Republicans that approve of Governor Biden is similar to the 2 in 10 who oppose the recall efforts. We find that majorities across regions and demographic groups approve, although approval is lower among men than women, whites and other racial ethnic groups, and it declines with income as it increases. Regarding the leaders in the House of Representatives currently, we find that half of Californians approve of Speaker Pelosi, with 3 in 4 Democrats, 4 in 10 independents, and about 1 in 10 Republicans approving of her. When it comes to Minority Leader McCarthy, we find that Californians are more likely to disapprove than approve, with 3 in 10 Californians saying that they're unable to rate Leader McCarthy at this time. Fewer than half across parties, regions, and demographic groups approve of his job performance currently. And when it comes to Congress, we find that about 4 in 10 Californians approve of Congress, while about half disapprove. This is similar to the views that we found in January. And we also find that nearly half of Democrats approve, compared to 1 in 3 independents and 1 in 5 Republicans who approve. As we saw optimism about the state budget situation, we also see optimism about the financial outlook for the US during the next 12 months. And in fact, we see a record high 55% saying that they expect good times in the next 12 months. This is up 10 points since January and up actually 32 points since last May. Positive perceptions are much higher among Democrats and Republicans and independents. And while just 4 in 10 in the Inland Empire expect good times, we see majorities expecting good times elsewhere in the state. And across racial ethnic groups, there's a divide, with more than 6 in 10 African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos expecting good times, while whites are slightly more likely to expect bad times than good times. So regarding the coronavirus and the vaccine for it, vaccines became widely available to Californians age 16 and up on April 15th, and we've continued to see an increase in the share saying that they've already received the vaccine or that they will definitely get the vaccine. In fact, we've seen a 25-point increase in this since January. However, we still do see about 1 in 6 saying that they will probably or definitely not get the vaccine, and that's only down slightly from January. Also, while we do find that increasing shares of Californians have been getting the vaccine, African Americans and Latinos remain less likely than whites and Asian Americans to report having already received the vaccine. About 4 in 10 Republicans currently say that they will probably or definitely not get the vaccine. This is unchanged from March and basically 5 points down from our January number. And this share of Republicans makes them the most likely to hold this view across any region, demographic group, or partisan group. and comparatively, fewer than 1 in 10 Democrats and just 2 in 10 independents say they probably or definitely won't get the vaccine. So in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling last year that extended protections guaranteed by the Civil Rights Act to lesbian, gay, and transgender Americans, Democrats introduced the 2021 Equality Act in Congress, and in fact, it's passed the House and is awaiting a decision in the Senate. This act would amend the 1964 Civil Rights Act to explicitly prevent discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And when asked about this, we find that overwhelming majority of Californians are supportive, with Democrats twice as likely as Republicans to support the act. We also find that there's widespread support for the act, with 6 in 10 across regions and 2 in 3 across demographic groups saying that they support this bill. And speaking of the Supreme Court, as we await a decision regarding the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, we find that Californians continue to have a favorable review of the 2010 health reform law. Opinions today are nearly identical to October 2020, just prior to the Supreme Court hearing, in fact, matching a record high 60% who view the Affordable Care Act favorably. Similar to prior surveys, partisans are strikingly divided, with the majority of where we also find a majority of independents view the law favorably. Positive views of the Affordable Care Act are highest in the San Francisco Bay Area at 67% and lowest in the Inland Empire at 49%. Californians are more positive, slightly more positive than adults nationwide when we look at a Kaiser Family Foundation poll from February that found that 55% of Americans view the law generally favorably. And so while I was able to touch upon a lot of the topics that we have in our survey, I do encourage you to visit our website where you can find our full survey report, as well as crosstabs and time trend documents where you can take a closer look at the data on a wide variety of issues affecting this people of California. And before we open it up for conversation between Mark and I want to remind everyone to please submit your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com, and please include your name and the name of your organization. So at this point, I'll stop sharing my screen, and we'll bring Mark back in for a conversation to see what interesting views he has on this great survey.
Wow. What a survey. I mean, what this one for the record books, Dean, just in terms of the time that we live in and how that's reflected in the survey findings today. Most of the media attention today was on the governor's recall questions. That's been a big news event all year, and we've been tracking that. But I thought I would spend just a few minutes talking about some of the other significant findings in this survey, which is part of our Californians and Their Government series, and really the purpose being to monitor and track and also surface new issues that are coming about both at the state and the national level. One question that we always look at with great interest in the May survey is how people in California are viewing the state's most important problem. It's the first question in our survey, and it's an open-ended question. So before we get into any details, we ask people basically what's on their mind. What do they think is most important? And this month, jobs in the economy was the top issue at 20% and COVID at 16%. Those are of course issues which are very much on everyone's mind this past year. as we've experienced both COVID and its economic impacts. In the course of the past year, this is one time now in which COVID actually comes in second, which I thought was interesting. Jobs in the economy named by 20%. And so I think Californians will be looking over the next few months about, what's going on with our economy. We have high unemployment, things are improving, but will they improve uniformly? What will it mean to have the full reopening of the economy that the governor has announced for June 15th? And so that now is become a dominant issue, and COVID, while very important, still definitely slipped from its higher ranking in the surveys over the course of the past year. I also found of great interest that there were two issues tied for third place, and they both involve housing. Homelessness at 10% and housing costs and availability at 10%. So that's 20% altogether who are mentioning housing related issues as their top concerns. It's a theme that we've seen throughout our surveys in recent times as housing prices have increased, as the number of homeless people in the state have become a great number, and as Californians more and more notice the homelessness in their own communities. So we will be watching with great interest what our state and local government and what federal funds are available around issues involving housing in California, because very, very significant issue for California's future. If we look at the questions which we have been tracking over the past year on COVID and the economy, the number one and number two issues, clearly we see some very positive trends on both dimensions. The number of people who are mentioning COVID is something that is of concern to them, diminished greatly from where it was even just a few months ago when we were experiencing a surge in COVID cases. And more people saying that the state is doing a good job with the vaccine distribution. About 7 in 10 now saying that, compared to fewer than 3 in 10 at the beginning of the year. So those are all very positive trends. More people now saying that the economy over the next 12 months is going to be in good shape, rating their own personal finances as in good shape as well. But amidst these positive trends, both for COVID and the economy, it's very important from the perspective of making California a better place for everyone, to note that we still see disparities both on race and ethnicity and economy. So disparities, as Dean mentioned, with who has received the vaccine to date, disparities by income and race and ethnicity around COVID still present in terms of who worries the most about getting sick and hospitalized from COVID. And those are trends that we've seen not only in our survey, but in the public health statistics over the course of the last year, racial and ethnic disparities and income disparities. We also see those disparities in terms of the ratings of the economy and specifically people's own personal finances. As Dean mentioned, for people who earn over $80,000 a year, lots of them saying that their finances are in excellent and good shape. For people who are making less than $40,000 a year in California, quite a few people saying that that they're not in good financial shape this year. And so those trends are going to be very important to watch as state and federal policies seek to address some of the economic disparities that have stayed with us and during the pandemic certainly they were in California before, but more noticeable now even than before the pandemic. And on that note, I would just like to, in thinking about California's future, recognize once again the fact that most Californians say that that growing income inequality is something that is taking place in the region that they live in their part of California, that they're perceiving a growth in the amount of inequality in incomes between those who have decent economic resources and those who don't. And one very important discussion that will continue to take place in Sacramento and around the state is, what is the role of government? What can government do, and what should government do about the growing gap between the rich and the poor in California? Most Californians now saying that this is a state in which there are two Californians, one California for the wealthy and one California that exists for those who are not well off. And the role of government in making opportunities more readily available and improving the economic conditions of those who have fallen behind economically is going to be a very, very important discussion for the legislature and for state and local governments going forward. So I'll just stop with those key takeaways. And Dean, anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, there's a lot of great stuff here, beyond, what we even talked about here. And the fact that there is the economic divide on the question of if your finances are better or worse compared to a year ago, where we're seeing a higher share of lower income folks saying that they're worse off than a year ago. And so that's something that to really consider, as well as the fact, on the issue of should the state do more, we've consistently found when there have been policies proposed to do things like another round of stimulus checks or rental and utility assistance, that Californians are very supportive of this. And in fact, regarding the rent and utility assistance, there's even bipartisan agreement that this is something the state should be doing. And so as we look to the future, how can we build upon these kind of pandemic things that policies that are taking place to kind of move forward? So that's going to be an interesting conversation.
Yeah. Okay, so we'd like to go ahead and answer your questions now. We've gotten some questions in from the audience, and as a reminder, you can still submit your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. So yeah, send us your questions. We're always interested in answering them. And Dean, I'm going to send this question about survey methodology your way. The question from our audience member was, how did you cull your survey sample? You described its demographics, but didn't say how it was created. Where did the actual names/numbers come from? Does it match the demographics of current Californians?
It's a great question. And I'll say that, this survey in particular was done using a random digit dialing methodology, where essentially every number in the state is available to be called. And we're doing this on cell phone and on landline, as people have increasingly relied on cell phones. And regarding the demographics, I'll just say that, the unweighted demographics are not all that far off from where we get with the weighted demographics, which we use the state Secretary of State numbers regarding party registration, as well as the most recent numbers from the US Census regarding population, regarding like region, education, gender, and we weight to those things so that the final demographics of the survey among all adults are very similar to the demographics of the current population, using the most up-to-date figures that we can get from the US Census Department. Yeah,
Yeah,
hopefully that answered that.
it is a great question, and I want to just add one comment, and that is that in the Californians and their government surveys, we are using live telephone interviewing to reach all adults. We want to reach all adults because, you know, there are roughly 20 million registered voters in California. There are roughly 30 million adults in California. And we want to represent all adults. And then from that all adult sample, we will ask people if they're registered to vote. So we have then a voter sample within that, which is a very substantial size, roughly around of the 1,700, roughly around, let's say 1,400 or so. And then we also then, of those registered voters, will select those who, based on their answers to questions about their past voting, their current interest in politics, how closely they're following election issues, will select people who are the, we define as likely voters. So this is different from other surveys you might see that start with registered voters. And it's different for a reason that is very specific to our purpose at PPIC. And that is to reflect the views of all adult Californians, and then also to be able to then provide, so that we can provide a voice for those individuals who live in the state, whether they're registered to vote or not, and then to select people who are most likely to participate in elections and of course affect public policy through the way they vote. Let's see what other questions might have come in. Here's a question about, your survey has a number of findings about the economy and economic outlook. Does the survey shed light on how Californians are thinking about any economic policies or proposals in particular?
Well, we asked about two specific proposals that the governor kind of outlined in the lead up to his May revise. As I mentioned earlier, you know, strong, overwhelming support for both another round of stimulus checks for lower income folks, as well as strong bipartisan support for rental and utility assistance for those folks who have fallen behind in the pandemic. So those are two very specific things that I think would also be in line with questions that we asked in March and we asked in January about things the governor wants to do on the economic front. And Californians have been supportive of those policies each time we've asked those questions.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. And interesting that there was even more agreement and even more bipartisan consensus about those measures that had to do with housing, with rent in particular. I think going back to the fact that so many people view housing and housing costs and availability as the #1 problem in California today. So what do you make of how low the share is for people saying the state budget situation is a big problem? And do you think this is a reflection of a high level of awareness of the size of the surplus?
Well, as I mentioned, we did kind of field the survey starting Sunday night, and then that Monday, the governor began his week of sneak peeks that kind of culminated on the Friday with the May revise. And then the Saturday news was all about that. So there was a kind of level of awareness throughout this process, given the governor was in front of a microphone each and every one of those days, introducing a part of his, you know, California comeback plan. And so from that standpoint, I do think that people were aware of that. And I think it probably is reflecting in the fact that most people are not viewing it as a big problem. Not to say that they're not looming problems or potential problems in the future that could happen. But I do think that this current time, people are viewing that very positively.
Yeah, it's amazing when you look at the difference between this time and the Great Recession or the early 2000s, other times when there have been serious deficits. And today it's relatively small. Numbers of people saying that the budget situation is a big problem. And interestingly, a very, very divided partisan outlook on the budget situation, where relatively few Democrats are saying the budget situation is a big problem, and Republicans are much more likely to say that the budget situation remains a big problem in California today, which is something that we've seen in the past, the difference between Democrats and Republicans, but it's even more notable today in the context of a time when the state has a multi-billion-dollar surplus. Another methods question, Dean. We love methods questions on the survey team at PPIC. With the COVID-19 shelter in place effectively over and people at home less, will this pose challenges for conducting a phone survey?
Great question. I do think that one of the kind of unexpected, quote unquote, good things that came out of this pandemic is that people were at home more, and we did see response rates kind of uptick some, and nationally as well. And so I think, once this kind of goes back to quote unquote normal, we will, be back to rates that were probably similar to before, but we're always looking for ways to improve those response rates. In particular, over the last year and a half now, we've been recontacting folks that agreed in a prior survey that they would be happy to talk to us again. And so these folks make up a smaller portion of the survey respondents, about 30% on average in any given survey. But these are folks that we know have already completed one survey and they've agreed to be recontacted. So we've done that as a way to kind of at least be able to help with the response rates. And as always, we're just looking to see what we can do regarding the mode that we use, the methodology that we're using, the steps that we're working with our call centers to kind of improve the response rates, because it has been an issue in recent years. And so it's something that's always on our mind. It's one of those things that keep us up at night, I think.
Yeah. One thing that I want to mention is, and I turned my sound off for this, but 75% of our interviews are conducted with cell phone. And of course, this is something that, as we all know, travels away from home. So in that respect, how much people are spending time at home, it's less relevant today than it would have been when we were conducting phone surveys, 20 years ago. There's just, I guess, one other thing that I'd like to make sure that we hear from Dean about anything in particular that surprised you about the May PPIC survey on Californians and their government.
Well, the one thing that I think it was a little bit surprising, but it's very important for the recall context, is just how things have changed over the last few months. So, to tick off a few among likely voters, Newsom approval on handling COVID up 11 points since January. The direction, how people think the state is headed, up 5 points since January. The budget as a big problem, a record low. This view that the state is in a recession, down 21 points since January. The view expecting good times economically in the US, up 11 since January. Coronavirus concern, down 38 points since January. The belief that the worst of the coronavirus is behind us, up 31 points since January. And as Mark mentioned, the share of folks saying that the vaccine distribution has been excellent or good is actually up 42 points since January. And so this is setting the stage for how people are feeling about the recall. And so I think these numbers among likely voters are extremely important to just, to set the context as it is today. That doesn't mean that a wildfire season or that, a slippage regarding COVID couldn't happen. But as people are viewing the recall situation today, these are the kind of perceptions that they're holding compared to January. And so it's just been a sea of optimism on so many factors. And so that's been surprising and also, just good to see, I think, that things are, going back to at least somewhat pre-pandemic.
Yeah, those changes were really remarkable, particularly related to COVID and the economy this time, and the overall outlook now, California is so much brighter. So I'm going to give you the flip side of what surprised me the most about this survey, and I'm going to say that when the numbers came in, the thing that surprised me the most was the fact that there was so little change in the attitudes towards the recall election. 40% in May, 40% in March, compared to 38% who didn't vote for Newsom in 2018. And how little during this time in which there's a sea of optimism, the governor's approval ratings changed. I mean, we have seen in our polling majority approval all year, but it was 54% in May, 53% in March, 52% in January among likely voters. I mean, that's all within the margin of error. So what does that tell us? Oh, and just one other thing about the surprising or related to the recall, how few people have not made up their mind about the recall. Usually, if we're talking about a ballot measure, even if we're talking about a candidate election, it's not surprising, 10, 15% of the people, months before the election is going to occur. But 3 to 4% saying that they don't know, that's not a lot of people. A lot of people have made up their mind. A lot of people have not changed their mind. And a lot of this is driven by the fact that Democrats and Republicans see things very, very differently in the country as a whole and in California in particular. So I would just want to note that. Well, we've reached the end of our program. And Dean, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today. And I'd also like to thank our colleagues who aren't with us today, who are on the report cover. Deja Thomas, who was the co-manager of this survey with you, and Rachel Lawler, who was also a report author. And I want to thank them, and I want to thank you for all the work that made this possible.
Yes, and thank you for all of your leadership on this and everything else at PPIC.
Thank you. We'll see you soon. I'd like to thank our survey funders, and finally, thanks to all of you for joining us today. Later today, you're going to receive a survey. This one will be about this event. So we hope you'll take a couple of minutes and let us know how we did, what we can do to improve moving forward in the future. We look forward to the next event and hope you will join us. In the meantime, thank you. Please be safe and have a good afternoon.